One of the biggest problems I've had in doing reviews on this channel is how best to tackle documentary cinema. I like documentaries. I don't watch as many as I'd like to, but I like them. And over the years I've seen quite a few I'd like to tell you about, but I've never been able to make a full script out of talking about any one single documentary. So today I'm going to be rolling together a few documentaries that I've seen that have really left an impact. These aren't in any order of preference, I like them all. So if you see something here that you think you might like, go and check them out. Anyway, on with the show. The Devil and Daniel Johnston was one of the first documentaries that I consciously remember sitting down and watching, and it absolutely blew me away. I had been aware of Johnston's music for a good period of time before seeing this documentary, though I will admit at the time I'd only really heard the hits. This film completely opened the door to Johnston's world, and it quite literally changed my opinion on both celebrity culture, mental health, and the mentality towards the creative process. At the time I watched this film, I was an aspiring filmmaker. I still am when I'm available, but yeah. I'd only really worked on a few small-scale productions here and there, and almost entirely all personal projects. I'd always kind of felt that what I was doing at the time was insular, and I struggled to see a way to get my work out to a wider audience. This film completely changed my mind about that. Throughout the documentary, we're shown the life of Daniel Johnston, a singer-songwriter from Austin, Texas, who, due to a mixture of mental health-related issues, drugs, and being in the wrong place at the wrong time, inadvertently ended up becoming one of the shining figureheads of the late 80s and early 90s US counterculture. Becoming quite famous, but at the cost of his own mind. This documentary portrays Daniel as a genuinely lovely guy, immensely erratic at times, but genuinely lovely. A man who's absolutely passionate about his music and about the influences of his music. And at the impressionable age that I was when I first saw this documentary, it made me realise that being famous wasn't the goal of wanting to be a filmmaker or a musician. Making things that people enjoy and like is the goal. Fame is a byproduct of that, and shouldn't be seen as an aspiration. It's an attitude I've carried with me ever since, really. I make the films and the reviews that I make because I enjoy making them, and if other people like watching them, then all the better for it. We're incredibly lucky, really, as Daniel seemed to be something of a hoarder. A massive chunk of the documentary is told through his collective archive, which consists of mountains of scrapbook diaries, truckloads of audio cassettes, which mix audio log diary entries in amongst rough cuts of his developing albums, and first-person accounts of incidents in his life from family, friends, and close colleagues. It's a bittersweet film that doesn't shy away from showing the horrific effects of untreated and mistreated severe mental health-related issues. And it's a fantastic antidote to the kind of documentaries that glamorise mental health issues as some kind of creative genius streak. The reality is Daniel led a very unstable and slightly unsettling life, and this documentary doesn't shy away from that. Throw in some gorgeous cine, some inspired direction, and an absolutely kick-ass soundtrack, and you have a frankly beautiful and entirely memorable experience on your hands. The Devil and Daniel Johnston is an absolute essential watch if you've ever held an instrument or camera in your hands. As an aside, I feel it's appropriate to mention that a few years after my first viewing of this movie, I was given the opportunity to see Daniel Johnston live in Manchester. It was almost as bittersweet an experience as seeing the documentary, as Daniel seemed like a really cool guy, but due to the medications he was on, he was absolutely chained to a scripted routine. From the opening song to the final wave-off, with no deviation from that script whatsoever, everything was timed to the minute with no flaws or gaps. And he was shaking like a tree in a hurricane for the majority of the set, which I assume was down to nerves. To this day, I still have to say the man's an inspiration to me. Both him and the documentary always give me a confidence boost, and it rings a message loud and clear. Never give up on the things you love, because you may only be a few steps away from achieving happiness through them. Video Nasties: The Definitive Guide is, to my knowledge, the most comprehensive telling of the history of film censorship in the UK available at the moment. The amount of detail that's gone into this series is frankly absolutely astounding. So much so that they couldn't do it justice to just squeeze it all onto one documentary. Combined, volumes 1 and 2 comprise 6 discs that meticulously chart through the history of the rise of VHS and the critical censorship and draconian laws put in place to restrict artistic expression in the UK. I would consider Volume 1 an absolute essential, as the documentary itself covers the 1984 Video Recordings Act in detail. Please see my Love Camp 7 review for more information on that lovely little piece of legislation. It also covers the rise of the Mary Whitehouse Brigade and the media sensationalism towards the titular Video Nasties. It's a fascinating watch that deeply looks into how mob mentality can often cause more harm than good. And it surprisingly also takes into account the mindset of the people who were fighting to ensure more censorship was put into place within film and media. To the point where I went in ready to flick the V's at the establishment and came out somewhat more subdued. I mean, I still wanted to flick the V's at them, but maybe not quite as intensely once I understood their motives. While the documentary is worth the price of release alone, it's the extras that really make this set shine. On disc 1, not only is there the main documentary, there's also almost an hour of 70s and 80s pre-cert logos arranged as a montage, which was an absolute blast to sit through. There's also a full image gallery of all the Video Nasties covered in all 3 lists that were drafted up by the police. Discs 2 and 3 then run to well over 9 hours and in detail review and break down the entirety of the Section 1 and 2 lists of films that were banned, with insightful offerings by some of the UK's best film critics such as Kim Newman and Alan Jones. Also included after each review is the full theatrical trailer for each movie on the list. As if that wasn't enough, Volume 2 then covers off censorship from the very late 80s to the present day, covering incidents such as the media-whipped frenzy that came with Rambo 3 and Child's Play 3 being linked to murders and massacres, the legalisation of hardcore pornography in this country, and the eventual re-release of the Video Nasties to the public uncut, with discs 2 and 3 of that set covering all of the Section 3 list, a set of 82 films that were considered for being banned but ultimately weren't. Again, fully reviewed and with the original trailers intact. This really is a truly marvellous pair of documentaries. If you're a fan of gory horror or you're still into VHS, this really is a love letter aimed directly at you. And Volume 2, while slightly less essential, is a wonderful encore that ties everything up nicely and helps really underline the definitive nature of just how definitive these are. Definitely worth your time and a set that I absolutely cherish. Grab them by hook or by crook. It was my uncle who first introduced me to the strange and new wave world of Klaus Nomi. And quite honestly, I've never seen anything like him before or since. A German operatic singer who arrived in New York at roughly the same time as an underground counterculture explosion was on the rise. Punk was taking hold, and this quite mild-mannered singer was about to become one of the most colourful, out there and unusual parts of history that a man wearing solely black and white would be capable of attaining at the time. Nomi, unfortunately, was one of the first people to die of the AIDS virus in 1983, and this film charts his somewhat tragic rise, fall and legacy in the arts movement. Included are several incredibly rare home video recordings of live performances, with many more live performances unobtainable or prohibitively expensive, music video clips and stories charting his history from friends and family, the people who loved him and the people who were somewhat shortchanged by him in his rise to stardom. Ultimately, Nomi seemed like quite a sweet man, though some people who actually knew him may disagree. This documentary doesn't shy away from some of the more unsavoury things he did in his life, but it's a very visual film, and I would suggest probably the most comprehensive documentary on the man that we'll ever see. And given how famous he was for that brief period of time, it's quite astounding at just how fragmented his history has become. Having fallen through the cracks or been broken up and split between multiple wealthy parties who all want a piece of the pie, it's unlikely that we'll see anything else regarding Klaus for some time. But this documentary does a very impressive job of placing you in the time, place and setting, and really making you feel like you're walking through his life from the beginning to the very end. Outside of A Music War, this is probably the only other film to feature Klaus, and as a result I would definitely recommend looking into this one. It's a somewhat bittersweet story, as barring some parts of Europe, Klaus never really made it out of New York. He was taken right on the cusp of him making it into the big time, and I think had he had a couple more years, and had he not tried to screw over his writing and production partner in the process, I think he probably would have been a worldwide star. As it stands, his position as a cult and gay icon is easily much more impressive in my opinion, and his work has almost certainly been an inspiration to me and countless others. So give this film a go sometime. I really can't say you'll be disappointed. Do you like documentaries that simultaneously put the fear of God into you whilst also making you feel like there's nothing left worth living for because everything you know and love could be wiped out completely and totally within the blink of an eye? Then QED A Guide to Armageddon is the documentary you need to see right now. This was produced in 1982 and was the 8th episode in the first season of QED, a BBC-produced series that looked into life, culture and science as a means of trying to find out where we were at the time as a race and where we potentially might have been going. Why is this one so standout? Well, it was written, directed and advised by Mick Jackson, who you'll probably best know as the man who wrote and directed another small, often forgotten film on nuclear annihilation. Oh, what was it called again? 1984's Threads. As a result, this documentary is almost comically bleak in its assertion of the fact that it's utterly hopeless to try and survive a nuclear apocalypse, with the first 10 to 15 minutes being based around showing what the effects of not even the biggest nuclear warhead available at the time, just a relatively common one, would be on the centre of London, making sure to advise that if you didn't vaporise, melt or end up fatally burned, that the radiation, breakdown of society and nuclear winter that would follow would pretty much see you off within a few weeks, if not days. Told you it was a cheery doc. There are some really fantastic model shots included in this, replicating with scientific accuracy the exact damage a blast would do to the centre of London. And I repeat, this is just the effect of one bomb. One bomb that isn't even the standard strength of bombs produced today, which are much more powerful. In the event of a nuclear conflict, there would be dozens, if not hundreds, dropped across not only London, but the entire country, effectively forming a nuclear blitzkrieg. And as if this documentary couldn't drop the audience any further into a sense of existential dread and hysteria, the latter 15 to 20 minutes of this one goes into the grisly details of whether you yourself could survive a nuclear explosion. The short answer is, unless you had between £12,000 and £16,000 of early 1980s money to build a concrete underground bunker with air filtration unit, then no. But the documentary doesn't just give up at saying that. Oh no! They dig out the official government guide to surviving a nuclear war and follow to the letter what's advised in those guides, with actual people. These guides are actually still used today. They haven't been updated. This includes forcing people to live in a trench that's prone to flooding, and helpful tips like make an A-frame out of all the doors in your house and then reinforce them with mattresses, which they then test using a mixture of model shots and scientific reasoning. These were, and I have to repeat this, are the only advisable tips the government have in the event of a nuclear conflict. So in some ways it's worth watching this 30-minute documentary just to get a sense of how in trouble you really are currently. It ends with an utterly bleak warning that basically implies that even if you did somehow survive a nuclear attack, not only would your time be short due to the incoming irradiated fallout, but what would you survive to see? I think it's the only time outside of a BBC comedy that I've actually seen a documentary advocate suicide in the event of a nuclear attack. It's a haunting documentary with some fantastic cine direction. It's genuinely one of the most memorable short documentaries I've ever seen. I think it should be shown in schools as an example as to why in the 21st century we can't just go to war, and that nuclear weapons are only insurance of our own mutually assured destruction. Scarier than many of the horror films I've reviewed on this channel, it's on YouTube in full, and I genuinely can't recommend enough that you go and check this out as soon as possible.